All right, let's dive right in.
Yeah,
Today we're taking a deep dive into Bank of India's second quarter performance.
we are.
We've got all kinds of stuff here, letters, financial statements, investor presentations, even the auditor's reports, so we can really get into it.
Absolutely. We're going to go way beyond just what the numbers are.
Right.
We really want to see what's interesting in these results, what strategies the bank might be pursuing, and what questions all this raises about the future.
Yeah, so let's start with the big number, the headline figures.
Okay.
The bank had a net profit of 2,037,369 lakh standalone and 2,042,129 lakh consolidated.
Big numbers.
Yeah, big numbers for the quarter.
They are, but what I think is really fascinating is the growth.
Oh, yeah.
Global advances are up by 14.51% year on year, but retail advances had an even bigger jump, 21.61%.
Yeah.
Now, if you're following the Indian financial scene, that's a big deal.
Okay, so what exactly are retail advances? Is that just like loans to people like you and me?
Yeah, you got it exactly.
That's okay.
Instead of just those big corporate loans. So Bank of India is really tapping into the consumer market here.
Okay.
And if you think about it, this is in line with what's happening in the Indian economy overall.
Right.
Consumer spending is becoming more and more important, and Bank of India is putting themselves in a position to take advantage of that.
It's not putting all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly.
And advances aren't the only thing that's growing. Global business is up 12.05%, global deposits are up 10.15%, and non-interest income, that's the money they make from things that aren't loans, is up by 7.26%. I mean, like, those are pretty good signs, right?
Yeah, absolutely. This means that the bank is doing well across different parts of its business. It's not just relying on one thing. And then we can't forget about asset quality, which is really important for any bank.
Right.
Bank of India's gross NPA percentage.
Yeah.
You think of that as the portion of loans that have gone bad, it actually went down by 143 basis points. And the net NPA percentage, which includes the money they've set aside to cover potential losses, that dropped by 60 basis points.
So they're getting better at handling those bad loans.
Yeah, that's a good sign. Now, the question is, what's causing this improvement? Is it better risk management, a better economy, or is it a combination of those things? We need to dig a little deeper to get the full picture.
Right. Okay, so you were really interested in what makes up the bank's global deposits. What did you find there?
Well, it seems like there's a shift happening.
Okay.
They're relying less on bulk deposits. Those are big deposits from institutions.
Right.
And more on retail term deposits. Those are the fixed deposits that regular people like us make.
So they're diversifying their funding, making themselves less dependent on those really big players.
Exactly. It adds some stability. Now let's look at what makes up their gross domestic advances.
Okay.
This is where things get really interesting. There's been a big jump in what they call RAM advances.
RAM, what is that?
It stands for Retail, Agriculture, and MSME. These are loans going out to regular people, farmers, and small businesses. It seems like Bank of India is really trying to reach those core parts of the Indian economy.
Isn't focusing on RAM a bit of a risk, though? I mean, those areas can be hit harder when the economy isn't doing well.
There's definitely risk involved,
Right.
but there's also a big opportunity. If those sectors do well, Bank of India is going to benefit a lot. And remember, India has a lot of potential for growth in these very sectors.
So they're kind of like betting on the future of the Indian economy,
That's one way to look at it.
which a lot of people are watching very closely these days. Now, within those retail loans,
Yeah.
there are two types that stand out, home loans and vehicle loans.
Yeah. Home loans grew by a pretty decent 17.19% year on year, and vehicle loans really jumped ahead with a 29.03% increase.
Wow.
That tells us that people are feeling confident about the economy. They're willing to spend money on big things.
Yeah, that's definitely a good sign. And we can't forget about those priority sector advances. Bank of India actually went beyond the required targets for important areas like agriculture and microenterprises.
That's a really big deal. These are areas that often have trouble getting financial services. And Bank of India is really stepping up to help.
So they're not just about making money, they're also thinking about how they affect the bigger economy.
Yeah, it looks like they're trying to be a responsible corporate citizen.
So we talked about the business now. Let's get into the financial statements and see how the money's moving.
Okay, let's dive into the details. What do you want to start with?
Well, the operating profits are pretty good, aren't they? Which means they have a decent profit even before they account for provisions.
You're right, they are doing well there. Both the interest earned from their loans and the other income are helping them perform well. We do need to take into account those new RBI norms for how they classify their investment portfolio, though.
Right.
That had some effect on the numbers.
Yeah, that one-time gain they had to recognize because of the new rules.
Right.
It makes comparing numbers from different periods a little tricky.
It does. The important thing here is to look at the bigger picture,
Okay.
not just focus on the individual numbers.
So it's not just about the numbers themselves. It's about what they tell us about the bank's overall health and strategy.
Exactly. Now, any deep dive into how a bank is doing has to include asset quality.
Right.
That's where things can get a little complicated.
Yeah, we have to talk about those NPAs, the loans that haven't been paid back as
Yeah.
promised. Let's be honest, it's a really important indicator of how financially healthy a bank is.
You're absolutely right. We can't ignore those sounds. Bank of India has set aside money, what we call provisions, to cover potential losses from those bad loans.
Like a safety net in case those borrowers can't pay back.
Exactly. It helps keep the bank financially stable. But it's not just about the NPAs we see right now.
Right.
We also have to think about the accounts that have been restructured.
What are restructured accounts?
Basically, it means the bank is working with borrowers who are having trouble making their payments.
Okay.
They might change the loan terms, like extend the time to pay or lower the interest rate to help the borrower get back on track.
Give them some breathing room so they can hopefully catch up.
Exactly. But of course, there's still risk there.
Right.
So Bank of India is being careful and setting aside some extra money, what they call an additional provision, specifically for these restructured accounts. This falls under what's called the Resolution Framework 2.0.
Like a backup plan just in case those restructured loans still don't work out.
Precisely. Now we need to talk about the elephant in the room, fraud. The report mentions some pretty big fraud cases that came up during this time.
Oh, fraud. That's not something you want to hear about with your bank.
No, it's not.
What can you tell us about these cases?
Well, the amount of money involved is significant, and the report goes into detail about the provisions they've set aside to cover the potential losses from this. It's a reminder that even with all the sophisticated systems banks have, they're still vulnerable to fraud.
That's a little scary.
Yeah,
It makes you realize that even with all the rules and protections, there's always some risk.
exactly. Now, while we're talking about provisions, we should look at what they've set aside for those RBI-referred NCLT accounts.
Wait, hold on. What are NCLT accounts again?
Okay, so you can think of these NCLT accounts as companies that are in deep financial trouble.
Okay.
The RBI, which is India's central bank, has basically said these companies need help getting back on their feet and referred them to a special tribunal called the NCLT, which stands for National Company Law Tribunal.
So it's kind of like a last resort for these companies?
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
And because Bank of India wants to be careful, they've set aside some money provisions just in case these companies can't pay back their loans.
Got it. So another layer of protection for the bank.
Yes.
Okay. So we've looked at business performance, financial details, and even those tricky asset quality issues. What's next?
Let's talk about the bank's capital strength.
Okay.
You can think of a bank's capital like its financial foundation.
Right.
It's what allows them to handle losses and support future growth.
And it looks like Bank of India has a pretty strong foundation. Their capital adequacy ratio, which measures how much capital they have compared to their risk, is at 16.63%.
That's a good number. It means they have a solid buffer to absorb any unexpected problems. And don't forget about the government stake in the bank.
Right, the big shareholder. The government of India owns 73.38% of Bank of India.
That's significant.
Yeah,
It shows a level of support that gives confidence to investors and depositors.
right. So we've spent a good amount of time going over these financial statements and reports. But let's go beyond the numbers for a bit.
Yeah.
What about those things that don't always show up in spreadsheets? Like their digital initiatives, their efforts on environmental, social, and governance issues, what they call ESG, and the bonds they raised this quarter.
Yeah, the investor presentation gives us some good information about all of that.
Okay.
It shows that Bank of India is embracing innovation and sustainability. They're not just focused on the numbers, they're adapting to the changing world of banking.
They're trying to stay ahead of the game.
Exactly. They're going digital, they're paying attention to ESG, and they're actively managing their capital.
Speaking of those bonds they raised, that was a pretty strategic move, wasn't it? Can you explain bonds to me in simple terms?
Sure, think of it as the bank borrowing money from investors.
Okay.
They issue these bonds, which are basically like IOUs,
Right.
promising to pay back the money plus interest at some point in the future. It's how they get money to grow and pursue new initiatives.
It's like taking out a loan to invest in their future. But doesn't taking on more debt always come with some risk?
Of course it does.
Yeah.
It's about finding the right balance. They have to make sure they can handle this extra debt and make enough money to cover the interest payments. But it also shows that they're being proactive about getting the money they need to achieve their goals.
So a calculated risk, but one that could have a big payoff if they do it right.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've analyzed the numbers, looked at their strategic changes, and even discussed those qualitative aspects like digital initiatives and ESG. What's the main takeaway here?
Well, I think it's safe to say that Bank of India is showing that it's resilient and adaptable. They're not afraid to take calculated risks. They're investing in their future, and they're making a conscious effort to adapt to what customers, investors, and society as a whole are expecting from them.
They're trying to find that sweet spot between being a stable, reliable institution and embracing innovation and social responsibility.
That's a great way to put it. And it leads to a question for our listeners.
Hit me with it.
Given Bank of India's increased focus on RAM lending and their move towards digital banking, how do you think this will position them in the competitive world of Indian banking?
That's a great question. Are they making the right moves to stay ahead of the game?
Exactly. Think about the competition, the changing needs of customers, and the potential risks and rewards of these strategic choices.
Right.
There's no easy answer, and that's what makes it such a fascinating question to think about.
Wow, this has been a really interesting deep dive so far,
It has.
but we're not done yet. We'll be right back to dig into even more of Bank of India's performance.
Sounds
We're back, and we're still digging into Bank of India's second quarter results. We've talked about their focus on RAM, letting their push into digital, and how they're handling those NPAs and provisions, but there's more to unpack.
Yeah, there is. We've talked a lot about the numbers, but I want to shift gears a bit and talk about something that doesn't always get enough attention, the bank's digital initiatives.
Okay.
It's not just about having physical branches anymore,
Right.
It's about being where your customers are, which more and more means online and on their phones.
That's the age of digital everything, isn't it?
It really is. From shopping to banking, it seems like everything is moving online.
It does. So what is Bank of India doing to keep up?
Well, if you look at their investor presentation, there's a whole section dedicated to their digital strategy.
All right.
They're putting a lot of resources into mobile banking, online platforms, and even things like artificial intelligence and data analytics.
So it sounds like they're really trying to make banking easier, more accessible, and more personalized for their customers.
Exactly. And put yourself in the customer's shoes for a second.
Okay.
Wouldn't you prefer a bank that makes things easy for you? A bank that understands what you need and can give you solutions that are tailored to you?
I think most people would.
That's exactly what Bank of India is aiming for.
It sounds like they're trying to compete with all those fintech startups that are popping up everywhere.
Yeah.
The ones offering all those new and innovative financial services.
They definitely have to stay competitive in this fast-changing environment. And it's not just about keeping up with the technology, it's also about finding and keeping the talented people who can lead these digital initiatives. It's a whole new game.
It is. So digital transformation is a big deal for Bank of India.
Mm-hmm.
What about their commitment to those ESG factors we talked about earlier? Environmental, social, and governance issues.
That's another area where they're really stepping up their game. If you go back to their investor presentation, you'll see they have specific targets and actions related to sustainability, social responsibility, and corporate governance. They're looking at things like reducing their environmental impact, promoting financial inclusion, and making sure their business practices are ethical.
So they're realizing that it's not just about the bottom line anymore. It's about having a positive impact on the world.
Right. Investors, customers, even employees are all starting to demand that companies be more responsible and sustainable. And Bank of India is paying attention to that shift and changing its strategy accordingly.
It seems like they're trying to be the bank of the future, not just financially sound, but also ethically and environmentally conscious.
I think that's a great way to put it. Now, there's one more thing we need to talk about, those bonds that Bank of India raised during the quarter.
Yeah, those. We talked about it a little earlier, but I think it's worth another look because it's a big part of their overall financial strategy.
It is. So remember, bonds are basically a way for them to borrow money from investors to help fund their growth plans.
Right, like taking out a loan to invest in the future. But doesn't taking on more debt always come with some risk?
Absolutely. It's a balancing act. They have to make sure they can handle this new debt and make enough money to cover the interest payments. But it does show that they're being proactive about getting the money they need to reach their goals.
So it's a calculated risk that could really pay off if they make the right moves.
That's the idea. Now let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Bank of India is operating in a really complex and constantly changing environment.
Definitely.
They're facing competition from both traditional banks and these new fintech companies.
Right.
They have to deal with the challenge of managing risk and asset quality, and they're trying to keep up with a world that's changing really
It's a
fast.
lot to handle.
It is. So, given all these challenges and opportunities, what are your thoughts on their overall performance this quarter?
Well, it seems to me the Bank of India is showing that it's tough and it can adapt.
Yeah.
They're not afraid to take some risks. They're putting money into their future, and they're making a real effort to meet the expectations of customers, investors, and society in general.
Yeah, they're trying to strike that balance between being a solid, dependable institution and embracing innovation and social responsibility.
And doing a pretty good job of it.
It seems that way. But of course, there are always challenges ahead. The
Always.
banking world is always changing, and Bank of India will have to stay flexible and adaptable if it wants to succeed in this dynamic environment.
Wow. We've really gone deep into these Bank of India second quarter results.
We have.
From those big headline numbers to their focus on RAM lending, their digital push,
Oh, yeah?
and those ESG principles. We've looked at it all.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey through those financial statements, investor presentations, and auditor reports.
It has.
We've seen how they're dealing with a complicated and changing world, balancing growth with managing risk and trying to stay ahead of the game.
And you know what's really interesting is how these results tell a story that's about more than just the numbers.
Yeah.
We see a bank that's trying to adapt, innovate, and really position itself for the future.
Absolutely. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with something to think about. We've talked about Bank of India's move into RAM lending and how they're embracing digital transformation. So here's the question. How do you see these strategic moves playing out in the long run?
Ooh, that's a good one. Is Bank of India making the right choices? Are they going to become a leader in Indian banking, or are there some hidden dangers they need to watch out for?
Exactly. Think about the competition, the changing needs of customers, and the potential ups and downs of these strategic decisions. There's no easy answer, and that's what makes it so interesting to think about.
It's like a puzzle trying to put all these pieces together and figure out what the future holds for Bank of India. And hey, listeners, we want to hear your thoughts on this too.
Yeah.
What's your take on Bank of India's strategy? Head over to our website or social media and share your insights with us. We'd love to keep this conversation going.
Definitely. We encourage you to keep learning and stay curious about the financial world. It's
Yeah.
fascinating, it's always changing, and there's always something new to discover.
Well, that brings our deep dive into Bank of India's second quarter results to a close. We hope you found this exploration helpful and insightful.
We did.
Until next time, keep those financial wheels turning